Bon, merci beaucoup et merci pour l'invitation. Je vais parler en anglais parce que je n'ai pas le vocabulaire professionnel en français. I hope that is all right with everyone. And as Franz said, we have in our practice that I have with my partner Ravi a very broad range of work. We do a lot of art-related work, we do a lot of work with history. This reflects both our personal interest, but it also very much reflects the conditions that we have in Los Angeles. You probably know Los Angeles is a very young city. It's a city that was developed entirely in the 20th century, really. And because of that, and because of the incredible growth that it went through, in particular after the Second World War, it developed into something like an architectural laboratory. And as a result, there is a very, very interesting collection, a fabric of historic buildings. It is, I would say, very difficult to work as an architect there without being confronted with this very rich heritage. But I would say this, what I call this tradition of experiment, is what also led to the fact that Los Angeles is now one of the, I would say, leading centers in contemporary art. New York is still probably the center of the art market in the United States, but art production has shifted to Los Angeles. This has to do with the fact that we have various very good art schools. It also has to do with very sort of pragmatic things. It's less expensive than New York. It's very pleasant to live there and so on and so forth. And so from the last 20, 25 years on, a lot of artists who historically maybe were living in New York are now living and working in Los Angeles. So as Franz said, I'm going to first show very quickly, without much explanation, some of our projects that are more similar to what architects do. Then I'll show a few of these art-related works, and then I'll focus on restoration and conservation projects that we have done. To begin with, it's actually very dark. This is actually the very first house that we did in Los Angeles on a very steep site. These are the pieces of land that you can get. And we built a house that sits on two concrete towers. The two towers contain all of the infrastructure, all of the power, all of the water, all of the heating goes up and down through these towers. The towers carry two steel beams. The steel beams carry a wood platform, and the whole house is framed in wood, which is the predominantly way of construction in Los Angeles. The house is covered on all sides, including the bottom, in Eternit panels. So this is what the house looks like from afar. The house is organized around a series of volumes that all contain storage. This is the garage, for example, or bathrooms and things like that, so that this space continues to flow around them, creating a public space and the private spaces. Views of this public space from one end to the other. This is actually the garage. So again, these first ones I'm just going to show very quickly without going into too much detail. A second house is a house that we did in Mount Washington for a young artist and a art historian called the Sola Wright House. Again, a very steep site. What we did here is sort of the opposite strategy. We excavated these sort of steps into the site with these concrete walls on which we then laid these three tubes. The tubes are entirely framed in wood, so there's absolutely no steel in them. The size of the tubes is dependent completely on the program. So the lowest level contains a garage, which is now used actually as a art studio. The second level contains a library, bedrooms, again, bathrooms encased in these volumes. You enter from the lower level, you come up to this point, then you move through the whole length of the building to the stair, and then you go up, so that moving to the top of the house means that you move both vertically and horizontally through the entire house. And at the top floor, we have a open living, dining, kitchen space. These volumes, as I said, contain infrastructure, they contain structure, they are the shear panels of the building. So again, very quickly, the approach, the entrance going up to the middle level. This is this hallway that I showed you. The floors and the ceilings and the walls are all treated in white. The idea was to emphasize this tube, and within this tube we have these wood boxes that are set in there and float in this space. And then at the top level, this living space. Very recent house that we did, which we call the house with 5 corners. Again, on a very difficult site, very, very narrow access, very steep here. There's a level area up here, and you see this cliff. This is the site of a water tank that existed here for decades, and our clients bought this piece of land. Various restrictions from planning, distance from this cliff, distance from the lot line, and so on and so forth, actually dictated this overall shape, this form. Most of the house is actually underground, and all of that is poured in place concrete. And at the top floor, we have a pavilion with 5 sides of glass, which is the living room and living dining kitchen space. So this is how you enter into the garage, or you go up the stairs to this level. On this level here, you have the 3 bedrooms that look out towards the view. And then on this top level, where you have access to the garden, you have this living space. Very quickly, the plans. So again, garage, you go up the stairs. This is a mezzanine with the entrance that leads to a stair that cascades through the entire house. On the middle level, you have access to these bedrooms. These bedrooms have access to bathrooms behind this core with bathrooms. And you arrive at the top here into this dining, living, kitchen space, and there's a study here. The roof then sits on these 5 massive steel beams. These are very dark, these images, but this is a view looking back. Going into the house, the contrast of the concrete versus the wood-clad inner walls, going up the stairs. I'm not sure if they're extremely dark, these images, but I'm not sure if there's anything that can be done. Should you? Okay. You have to imagine them a little bit brighter. So we go up the stairs to this middle level, view into the bedroom, up to the very top, and this top level where you have a view of the city. So here you would see this outline of the roof sitting on these 5 steel columns. And another early project that we did was actually a tanning salon, which is I think in French it's a salon de bronzage. And when we first were approached, we thought, how can one do something like that? But then we discovered that the beds actually produced incredibly beautiful light, and different models produce different colors of light. And we decided that we were going to use the light as the only decoration in the whole space. So that the actual rooms are enclosed in these volumes. The volumes are open at the top, and the beds, as they get turned on and off, produce these color combinations on the ceiling, which then really is the only decoration. So as you move through the space, and as it is used, you get this constantly sort of shifting, very sort of ephemeral, very delicate light patterns. So I'll show you a few of these art-related projects. The first one we did was with Olafur Eliasson. Eliasson is a Icelandic artist. He lives in Berlin now. A project that you may know is what he did at the Tate in London, where he converted this central hall into this absolutely amazing light installation, installing a reflected ceiling, a semicircle of light that was then reflected into a sun here. His gallerist, Amy Fontana, moved to Los Angeles and started what she calls the West of Rome series. And the first project that she wanted to do was with Olafur Eliasson. He found out about a house that we did, and he proposed a project for that. So this is the very first house that I showed you, the house on these two towers. What Eliasson proposed was to install a 120-foot diameter sun to the side of the building. We started working on this, including work with a structural engineer. At some point, we had to go and talk to the city of Pasadena, and they completely panicked and said that, well, this was a construction project, and we had to get permits. They knew exactly that this would stop the project because that would take about 2 years to complete. What Olafur did instead is he completely introverted the project into a installation where he painted this house that is all about light and lightness and views, completely black, installed a black rubber floor, closed off every single window, and except for one window, which he turned into a kaleidoscope. And within this sort of blackness, this sort of basement suspended 35 feet in the air, he installed a series of these light pieces that you would then you would wander through the house and look at them, except for this one moment where you had a view out through this disc that was sort of a memory of his original proposal. For about 15 years, we've worked with an artist named Sharon Lockhart, designing pretty much all of her installations, including one that is currently in Lucerne at the museum. It's the third station of an exhibition that started in Warsaw and then was in Stockholm. Her most recent body of work was on the work of the Israeli choreographer and dancer Noah Eshkol. Eshkol produced or developed this notation system, developed ways of drawings and ways of modeling this. These are a series of portraits that Sharon did of these. Eshkol also did a series of these carpets. So this was sort of the background for the project that Sharon did. It was first shown at the Israel Museum, and we developed the scenography for these archival materials for the carpets, and then in particular for the films, these 5 films that were shown essentially as sculptures, these sort of volumes freestanding in the space, and as you move around, you get these constant changes and shifts in the composition. The second project that was part of this that we did is where we designed the scenography for another film. It consists of 4 dances, 4 different scenes, and we developed a volume that was based on the dimensions of the human body. So this is currently shown in Lucerne right now. And a project that is a very large art gallery in Los Angeles, Blum and Poe. A shell that we converted into a gallery. The whole shell was built out of concrete block. We had to cut in windows, made these concrete frames. We had to close off windows, filling them with concrete. Within the gallery, there are storage spaces, gallery spaces, entrances on both sides, offices, so that the space is organized from one end to the other with the office, entrance, and the gallery spaces. So now the next project is where we want to get into architectural history, and so I'll slow down a little bit. A few years ago, we were approached by the artist Stephen Prina, who has for many years done very interesting projects where he catalogs and maps anything from paintings by Manet to Beatles LPs to titles of poems and so on and so forth. He came to us with an idea that we were really fascinated by because it bridged for us contemporary art with architectural history. He had seen in the 1980s in a store in Los Angeles a piece of furniture that he recognized as a piece by Rudolf Schindler, an important modernist architect, originally from Vienna, came to Los Angeles in 1920. The piece had been ripped out of the house and had been painted pink. And it sat in this window, and Prina told us that this image was sort of seared in his memory. He could never forget this image. So he identified two houses, the Harris House and the Hyder House, which both no longer exist. And what he wanted to do was to reconstruct every single piece of built-in furniture of these two houses. And for that, he needed assistance. So with the help of archival photos and the original Schindler plans, which are now at the Architectural Drawing Collection in Santa Barbara, we started to work, first identifying on the drawings every piece of this built-in furniture, and this is the extent of the detailing that you see on the Schindler drawings. The interesting thing is that Rudolf Schindler, in the 35 years of his career, actually never changed the detailing of his furniture. So we were able to go back to buildings that still existed, even some buildings that were built much, much later, and study the detailing, and from that extrapolate what the detailing on this furniture would have been. So the next step after we identified that was to model all of these pieces. It was a series of, I think, 29 pieces. And then from that, we developed very precise cabinetry drawings, much more precise than anything that Schindler would have ever done. The idea was then that these were built, they were actually built in Austria, and Stephen Prina then first stained them in the way that the furniture was originally stained. Rudolf Schindler had this idea that the furniture should, in a way, reflect the nature around the building. So these green tones, or silver green tones, were slightly different from one house to the other. And then once they were all stained, he painted them pink. So this is what they looked like in the end. He installed them basically as pieces of sculpture. They were no longer defining space. They were no longer meant to be part of a building, but really simply pieces of sculpture. He installed them on a very strict grid. The grid was determined by an alphabetic order. Furniture that came from the Harris House preceded furniture that came from the Hyder House. Furniture that was in the bathroom preceded furniture that was in the bedroom. And so he developed a sort of very strict catalog and then just installed this on this grid. This was at the Secession in Vienna. It was later shown in Los Angeles at LACMA as one of the Pacific Standard Time exhibitions that dealt with architecture in Los Angeles. Franz mentioned John Lautner. This is a very grimy picture of the chemisphere. I started working on John Lautner's work in around 1992, a few years after I moved to Los Angeles. I edited the first book on Lautner. He died around the same time that the book came out, and his family set up a foundation, donated the archive to the foundation, and I became the administrator for the archive, which meant that for years I looked after this material until 2007, when the archive was acquired by the Getty, where it now is. The Chemisphere is probably one of Lautner's best-known houses, and it was acquired in the late 1990s by a German publisher, Benedikt Taschen, who then asked us to restore this house. The house is consists of this concrete column that is embedded into the mountain, and the column is hollow. This is where all of the water and sewer goes up and down. This carries 8 steel beams that radiate from the center and are supported on these 8 diagonal steel beams. Then from here on, there is an additional steel piece that in turn carries a glulam beam that starts here and goes to the center of the house, where it's connected into a steel compression ring. So this is the skeleton of the house. None of the walls inside are load-bearing. What is quite interesting is that at the center of the house, you actually have this light space, a skylight that allows light to the center, to the fireplace. In plan, the house is organized into two sections. The public space, which overlooks the valley, the very expansive view, and overlooking the hill towards the south are a series of very small pie-shaped spaces. This was a house designed for a family with 4 children originally. And at the center, what I mentioned earlier is this fireplace space with the skylight. And you can see here on the drawings is a little bit of information on flooring material. There is some information on built-in furniture, though this is sort of the extent of the detailing on the drawings. The entire set of drawings for this house is about 5 sheets, so it's very, very rudimentary. The bedrooms, as I mentioned, look over the hill, so these smaller rooms have a very intimate relationship to the landscape, while the living room, the larger room, has this very expansive view over the San Fernando Valley. The fireplace area is here. This is the skylight, and please note these aluminum sliders, which is what the house originally had, and also the floor, which is different from what was shown on the drawings. It was a bit small tile floor. A lot of changes were made during construction simply for cost reasons. The house had gone through several owners, and they all did very strange things to the house. Built-in furniture was removed, painted surfaces, or surfaces had been painted, built-in furniture was damaged, surfaces were carpeted, and so on and so forth. So part of what we did here was really restoring the house, bringing it back to introducing some of the furniture that had been removed or was damaged. But it really didn't make complete sense to restore it to precisely what it was in 1960, because that's not what John Lautner wanted the house to be. As I mentioned, changes were made during the construction, and what we decided to do is to look at the original drawings, and through discussion with the original client and also with the new client who needed to make adjustments to the house, we did a series of interventions to the house that are not strictly restoration. What we did in the living room is that we installed a floor that was very similar to what Lautner had originally proposed, except that this was a cut slate floor. Other surfaces were cleaned carefully, furniture was reconstructed. Walls that had been shown in the original plan as being paneled in wood but were not done due to cost reasons and simply rendered in plaster were paneled, so that the wood from the kitchen area continued all the way to the back and to the other side, where we installed a sliding door, a pocket door that slides into the paneling. So this part is very much restoration, bringing the house back to what it should have been in 1960. The biggest change that we made was replacing all of the glass. You remember maybe the image with the aluminum slider here. We decided to take all of that out and to really exaggerate, in a way, the structure of the house, these curved glulam beams. We installed frameless glass here. We installed operable sliding glass panels here, very large panels that would move. And using, in a way, a technology that Lautner had used in a lot of his later projects. The back of the house, this is where originally there were bedrooms, was converted into an office with using some of the existing built-in furniture. In the master bedroom, the furniture had been completely removed. We had to reconstruct that. Originally, you slept with your head at the window. In the 70s, this was removed and a big bed was installed here. We designed a new bed with this tall headboard, so you sleep looking at the view, which is really what this house is about. We then also designed 2 additional projects which were unfortunately not built. One was a pool. The idea was that it would be at the same elevation as the house, but set much further back in the topography to give the house the prominence that we felt it deserved. So one was this pool, and the second one was a guest house that we designed to have a very different relationship to the ground than the house itself. Rather than floating above the ground, it would be wedged into this ravine, creating a bridge that would connect one side of the property to the other, and creating a space that would be used as a guest house with a small bathroom tucked in here. Working with Lautner led to all kinds of other projects. I co-curated with Nicholas Olsberg, who was for many years the director of the Canadian Centre of Architecture and chief curator, an exhibition on Lautner. We focused on archival material, on models. This is a model that actually comes from the office of Felix Candela. Lautner worked with him on at least one project. This is a model of an unbuilt house in Argentina, the Franklin house, a model of a built office, the Goldstein office. You see here this folded copper wall, which is on the east side of the space. The space looks out to the north. The idea was that the sun setting in the west would reflect off of this copper wall into the space. So the exhibition used a lot of these archival models as well as archival drawings, which we very simply showed on these plinths to create this topography of drawings. We did not show photos. We did not want to have materials that you can see in a book or in a magazine. Architectural exhibitions are always very difficult because you're not really showing the object that the architect creates, but you're sort of mediating between that, and you're maybe showing tools that the architect uses to develop the building. In addition to that, we had very large models built of 6 projects, and we had films made of those 6 projects, which were projected around this, the space. The idea of these large models was to not show the house as an object, which is not anything Lautner was interested in. What he was interested in was the space, and how you read the space, and how the space connected to the surrounding landscape. So to recreate this, to some degree, we had these abstracted views of the landscape that these houses look out to. So we had one house that was looking out over the ocean. We had one house that looks out over a snowscape. We had one house that looks out over the city. And all of them, as I said, were meant to be quite large so that you could really examine and experience the space of these buildings. Another very interesting architect, mid-century architect, is an architect named A. Quincy Jones. He did a lot of work with a developer named Eichler, the so-called Eichler houses that were built by the thousands in Southern California. Most of them were designed by Jones. Jones also did some case study projects, and I'll talk a little bit about the case study program in a second. He did, in addition to that, he did a few large houses. One of them is this one here called the Tire Residence. The house is comprised of 2 elements: a flat, very long bar that contains most of the private spaces, and is a pavilion sitting underneath this sloped roof which contains the public space. The public space is this here, glass on pretty much 3 sides. On one side you have a series of interesting baffles that you see here in photo. And the house also had various historic elements, and I'll talk about that in a second. In plan, the house was organized, again, this was the element that contained the bedrooms, this 1-story long element. This is the pavilion with the sloped roof, glass on the sides with the living room here. The public spaces, living room, dining room, and this playroom were all in original condition, in very good condition. The private spaces had all been modified. Some of it was modified during construction, some of it was modified after the house was occupied. So we made a few changes in this back area. These bedrooms were configured to have their own bathrooms. The master bedroom here was reconfigured to have its own bathroom that we cut out of this area here. The biggest change was that the house was originally designed for a family with a housekeeper, which was not how our client was going to be using the house. So this kitchen area that was originally completely separated from the house needed to be connected. And you'll see that in a second. So again, some of the work that we did here was really restoration work. We had to replace all of the glass. We did not want to replace it with dual glazing, but instead with laminated glass. We had to replace flooring materials. We had to replace some of the infrastructure. This is looking into this living room space, looking back. Furniture that had to be reconstructed, the built-in upholstered furniture. And this screen here is, you saw the black and white photo of it. There were originally 2 of these screens, one here and one here in the back, separating the dining room from the kitchen. Now this was one of the things that our client needed to change or asked us to change. But there is this very important wall that runs the entire length of the house, this oak wall. And it was important to us to respect that and maintain that. What we designed was a 20-foot wide panel, part of this wall, that slides open so that one can connect the dining room to the kitchen. So this is what it looks like when it's closed, open. And we redesigned a kitchen that was not meant as a kitchen for a housekeeper, but really a kitchen that was part of the living space. In other parts, we changed bathrooms. We restored furniture that was damaged. The master bedroom leading to the master bathroom, which has a wall of glass that slides into a pocket. The client is actually a Japanese businesswoman. She wanted us to create a Japanese onsen, a Japanese spa for the bedroom. The Ames House is a project that we have been working on for about 3 years. You are probably familiar with the case study program, a program that was developed by John Intensa, who was the publisher of Art and Architecture, a magazine that he did not start. He took this magazine over and completely reconfigured it. The case study program explored ideas of prefabrication, of ideas of developing inexpensively houses that could be produced and marketed widely. The The reality, though, was that there were only about 28 of these designed. Not all of them were built. And the two most famous houses are probably the Pierre Koenig house that overlooks Los Angeles, the Stahl house, which you probably know, and the Ames House, which is house number 8. Right next to the Ames House is the house that John Intensa himself had. So this is the site with the Intensa house, which was a collaboration between Ames and Saarinen. And this is the original design for the Ames House. Originally, they saw the house, they imagined the house as a bridge cantilevering from the hill through this row of eucalyptus trees, which is about here, that dominated the site. They didn't build the house for many years, and once they started to build the house, they realized that this meadow was something that was very important to them. They repositioned the house and set it very precisely at the bottom of the hill, between the toe of the hill and this row of eucalyptus trees. This is the famous photo of the Ames's constructing the house as it looked when it was first finished, and an interior view of the house. Now, the house in its 60 years had aged like any other house would age. Though it was actually in relatively good condition. You have to remember that the house was very carefully designed, it was very carefully built, and was very carefully lived in. The family continued to own the house. Ray Eames died in August 1988, 10 years to the day after Charles Eames died. When she died, Charles Eames's daughter, Lucia, took over the house, and she is the one who set up the foundation that now owns the house. The idea was really to preserve the house, which was something that at the time no institution would warranty. When the Eameses came to us to discuss the conservation of this project, we spent the first part just looking at this house very, very carefully. We discovered in the house various damaged areas, of course, but we also discovered things like this here. Unfortunately, this is again very, very dark. These are metal panels that have these sort of very delicate cracks and this grazing. And it was at that point that we told them that we should treat the house as if it were a valuable painting. It's very important that these traces that make up the atmosphere of the house, that make up the character of the house, are preserved. It would not make sense to remove any of this and to restore these surfaces to new ones. We then approached the Getty to get recommendations for conservators, people who would know how to deal with wood or plastics or metal. We didn't know at the time that the Getty was setting up what they call the Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative, which is an initiative that comes out of the field projects of the Getty Conservation Institute. And the idea of theirs was to combine in a way the specialists and the experts that they have with projects, 20th century architecture projects. They have, of course, been working on projects all over the world, from Pompeii to China to Central America, projects that are very important, very valuable, but it is not until this initiative was started that is focused on 20th century architecture. You have to remember that any project like that requires a small army of consultants, specialists in different fields and different areas. If we would have to hire these people, it would be an astronomical cost, money that the Eames Foundation actually does not have. They are struggling to raise the money to do this actual work. And so we were very lucky that the Getty was able to step in and take on a lot of this research. Some of the projects that the Getty started to do is this paint stratigraphy. We know that the house was painted several times. We know that the color of the house changed over the course of its lifetime. Ray Eames was a painter, and she continued to sort of change the color of the building so that on the outside it went from a charcoal to an almost black color. Now, the Eameses decided that the date that the house would be restored back to would be 1988, because that is the last time that one of the family lived there. And the family had, during the lifetime of the house, continued to change the building. Not just the paint color, but the floor, for example, I'll talk about that in a second, is something that was installed about 3 years after the house was completed. So this is this paint stratigraphy study that the Getty is doing, where they were able to identify these different layers of paint that were applied over the course of the lifetime of the building. This is a project that is still in research, so I cannot talk about the results yet, because this is something that the Getty will at one point want to publish. We also started a climate study project, because one of the goals of this project is to create a museum-level interior climate. It has to do with this massive collection of artifacts that the Eameses have in this house: books, fabrics, furniture, very valuable prototypes. And there is, of course, this sort of discrepancy between the house being this object that is operable, movable, you open this up, that's how you experience a house, and the need to create this museum-level climate, which doesn't really work with opening the doors, one would think. So what the Getty is doing is, for the last year and a half, they have been monitoring the climate inside the house and outside the house, mapping all of this, and the data that they are collecting will help them to, in about a year, develop what they propose to be the climate control system for the building. So this is one of the Getty scientists doing this work on the outside and on the inside. Now, the three things that I will talk about in more detail are: one is the windows. What is quite interesting is that the windows that the Eameses used were not designed as a curtain wall system. They were designed as windows that you would inset into a very conventional wall. They added them together with wood pieces that you see on the inside. They're painted black, but you can see them. And with these elements, they created this curtain wall. The windows, in particular the windows at the bottom, were all completely damaged. They were rusted. Because of the layers of paint that they had, they could not be opened or closed, which makes it very difficult to create any controlled climate. We then had to study these conditions, which we then mapped in a series of drawings. The other issue is that the house originally had 4 types of glass. Some of it was plate glass, some of it was what is called double strength glass. There is texture glass, and then there are basically translucent surfaces. All this sort of combination of glass says a lot about how the Eameses thought about privacy or transparency in the house. In the 1994 earthquake that we had in Los Angeles, about 40 panels of glass were destroyed, and they were replaced. And so in addition to these 4 different types of historic glass, we have three different types of relatively new glass. So what you see here is mapping all of these existing types of glasses onto these elevations. We then also had these window studies done where we examined every single frame, the operability of every frame, the condition of the putty, the condition of the steel, which was then also transferred onto drawings. And then all of that information from these different studies was transferred onto an enormous 3D model that we created in the office that allows us to, for example, identify all of the problems with windows to all of the problems on other surfaces in the house. So this is just one drawing out of this very, very large 3D model that we have here, focusing on the windows, on where we have cracks in windows or certain damaged areas in the window frames. Here you see what I mentioned earlier, these windows that are combined by inserting a piece of wood into a curtain wall. These are the pieces that were completely destroyed, they were completely rusted, which we had to replace. We also introduced weatherproofing, which we had to install in places that would not be visible in a closed or in an open position, to increase the amount that you can seal off the building. Now I have to say that in this first phase, the only work that was done was work at the very bottom. This had to do with coordinating this with the installation of the new floor. It also has to do with the fact that, as I said, the paint for the exterior is being studied. And we have to await this study to be able to then restore the rest of the facade and then paint it. And it also has to do with the fact that the Eames Foundation actually has to raise quite a lot of money to do this work. Now, all of this work on the windows was done pretty much on site. Here you see these sort of very corroded pieces being removed, being built on site, recreated on site, and then being very carefully installed. What you can't see here is a replacement mechanism being installed that allows the windows to be held in a particular position. And then we move on to the sliders. The house and the studio have 3 sliders basically. And it's very similar to the windows where the Eames has used off-the-shelf materials but combined them in, to some degree, sometimes slightly improvised manners. The steel frame of the slider then has, for example, these wood inserts. The idea was that the window frame would be kept as thin as possible, a very elegant frame. But of course the wood had deteriorated over the 60 years. These steel frames started to warp, started to curve, which made operability almost impossible. Some of them could not be opened at all, some of them only with great difficulty. And this issue also, of course, led to the house being very vulnerable to the intrusion of air, dirt, and water. We have a slider in the living room, in the kitchen, and in the studio. And they also all look very different. The one in the studio, for example, is broken into a series of smaller panels, which repeats sort of the rhythm of the facade that comes around the corner from the studio. So you see again here how the Eameses took certain ideas and then adapted them for the different places that they were used. This is the wood piece that I mentioned. What we did is, instead of the wood, we installed in the bottom of these steel tubes an additional steel member that would strengthen the frame, allowing it to stay straight and allowing it to be operable. Other parts of the slider were simply restored and kept. We did not want to replace parts. These are places in the slider where you can see work that was done, in particular here, where at the hand grab bar a new piece of wood was installed. Since none of this has been painted, you at this point can still see a lot of these interventions. Then the wood wall, which is this dominant element in the living room. First of all, nobody knew what kind of wood it was. It's not reflected on the drawings. Nobody in the office knew. Nobody in the family knew. The Getty took a small microscopic sample and was able to compare the structure of the wood to about 5,000 other species, and determined that it was a Australian eucalyptus, a tallow wood. You remember that the house sits behind this row of eucalyptus trees, and I was actually quite amazed to discover this very poetic connection to its site. The eucalyptus trees that are outside are repeated on the inside in a machined version. We knew that this was a flooring material that the Ameses had used and turned into vertical position, but we didn't know what kind of wood it was. The wall had suffered a lot of damage. There were stains, there were mechanical abrasions, and this is what it looked like. Now, when we started working on this project, we convinced the Ameses that it really would not make sense to restore this wall to what it looked like when the house was first built. Because again, we feel that these stains, these abrasions are part of the history of the house. They are traces that are very important to the building. What we did do is we examined the varnish and discovered that the varnish had was completely cracked. These cracks were filled with dirt, and the cracks also changed the way the light is reflected, which created a much grayer, much duller appearance for the wood. We decided not to remove the varnish, but instead to very carefully clean the varnish. The Getty then also recreated the formula of this varnish, applied an additional layer so that these cracks were filled in, recreating the way the light is reflected from the wood. Here you see this work being done. The first samples being taken to be examined. The main wood specialist who is examining this and then creating samples with the replacement varnish that was added on top of the existing varnish. So again, none of the original material was removed. And here you see this work in process. And I will now talk about the floor, which is what you see here. Again, this is actually a floor that was installed about 3 years after the house was built. It was a vinyl asbestos tile, and the name, of course, hints at some of the problems that you have. Over the 60 years, this floor had suffered greatly. There were places where the tile was detached. There were places where the tile was in fairly okay condition, but it had shrunk and we had bigger gaps. There was discoloration. We also discovered that the house had a humidity intrusion problem, humidity coming in through the concrete slab, which probably also contributed to the condition of the floor, but it was also going to be a problem developing the climate system, so that we knew that we had to figure out a way to stop the intrusion of this humidity. The floor was a off-the-shelf material. when we started working on this floor, we had this big discussion whether we should, in a way, follow the Ames's philosophy and use an off-the-shelf material, or whether we should recreate a floor and basically custom make the floor. The problem was that the off-the-shelf material, everything that we could find that was comparable in makeup of the tile and so on and so forth was just too white. And you have to remember again that Ray Eames was a painter. She had an incredible sense of balance for color, and it was very important to sort of maintain this balance. We had made very large areas, sample areas, and placed them in the house, and at that point decided jointly with the Ames Foundation and with the Getty that we were going to custom make the floor. The floor was actually not white. It is a very, very pale gray. So getting the exact match was a very involved process. We had tiles that were very carefully cleaned to reveal the original color. We knew that the color had actually been completely stable because when you cut the tile, you could see the same color throughout the whole tile. So that was the color that was used to recreate the tile. We also then had to cut it down to 9 by 9 inches, which is what the standard size was when the floor was installed. But nowadays the standard size is 12 by 12, and so we examined various different ways of cutting the tile, from laser cutting to water jet and so on and so forth. And what you see here are actually studies for these cutting techniques. As I mentioned, we had this water intrusion problem which we couldn't deal with until the floor was actually removed. Here you see the floor being removed by an asbestos abatement company. This, by the way, is the housekeeper of the Eameses, who still is at the house and looks after the house. She's been there for about 40 years. Once the floor was removed, the Getty took measurements over the course of several days to determine the relationship of humidity to temperature on the floor, in the space, in different parts of the room. And with that information, we were then able to research and find a vapor barrier. It is a system that consists of several components. I won't go into too much technical detail here. The important thing was that we could not change the very, very minimal relationships between the floor and the bottom of the frame. We had to maintain this. So we had this floor, this vapor barrier installed. And you see here the floor on the right being installed and put in place. And so this is again what the floor looked like when we started work on the house. On the right is the new floor. The view into the house. Towards the windows, again, the bottom part of the windows has been repaired. And looking towards the garden with the wood wall on the right. And this is the wood wall. Again, some of these stains are just part of the house and have been left. So I will end with a project that we are currently working on, which is an unbuilt house by John Lautner. This is a house that Lautner designed as a guest house to a house in the Hollywood Hills. The Lautner Foundation, as a matter of policy, has never allowed this before. The Franck Lloyd Wright Foundation allows that you can buy Franck Lloyd Wright plans and you can build this house somewhere else. But the Lautner Foundation never allowed that, simply because Lautner always designed a house very specifically for a site. In this case, our client actually owned the piece of land that the house was designed for, which is why the foundation made an exception. And then a few years later, he came to us to ask about being the executive architects on this project. The house is deceptively simple. It consists of a series of semicircles, concrete block, glass, concrete that are nestled and offset to each other. The walls underneath, below ground, slope outwards are concrete. The walls above ground are concrete block and follow the topography, so that you have inside this space with this concrete wall sort of sloping out and the concrete block sloping inward that carries the glass. The most complicated part of the project was really to update the structural system to what is allowable these days with the current seismic codes, because they have, of course, changed completely. We're working with a structural engineer named Andrew Nasser, who worked on about 20 of Lautner's projects. He's now in his 80s, absolutely brilliant man. We made some changes, pieces that were originally meant to be wood or steel. So this is actually a rigid steel frame that now carries the roof. We had to create bigger foundations for the building and so on and so forth. The second major problem was the amount of glass that the house had or has, and making sure that we can get this to pass with current, very strict California energy codes. To do that, we had to create an additional basement to offset the use. So this is the house that we have been working on for about 2 years. We submitted it to the building department last summer. Actually, when we come back to Los Angeles, we have a very important hearing with the city that will determine whether this house will move forward or not. So we're keeping our fingers crossed. But with that, I want to thank you for your attention.